Looking at 10.3 evidences for evolution. So we're going to be talking about several evidences for evolution. We're also going to be looking at how variation occurs in populations because we need to talk about that, and this is as good a place as any to do so. So one evidence of evolution is the fossil record. Fossils are preserved remains of past organisms. One of the things that fossil record allows you to do is compare with other organisms, right, to find relationships between those things that are new, those things that are old, see how changes occurred over time, can show link between ancestral species and species that we know and see today, and all things in between. Can find links between them, can find where they kind of split off into their own groups and so forth. Fossil record, it's usually the first place we go. Geographic distribution. Sometimes you'll see this called biogeography. It's the same kind of sort of thing. This is the idea that different organisms from similar environments all over the world develop similar adaptations. Let's see if I can say that a different way that makes more sense. So all over the world, you have similar kinds of ecosystems, right? You have jungles all over the world. You have temperate forests all over the world. Well, it would make sense that you might have similar kinds of organisms living in those similar kinds of places. It's not going to be the same. You're not going to find giant armadillos in Asia because armadillos don't swim the Atlantic Ocean, right? But you're going to find something similar because they live in similar kinds of environments. And so that's the big idea. Darwin noticed this on his voyage and began to take note of that. This is because different kinds or similar kinds of environments have similar kinds of selection pressures. That's a term that we'll use a lot talking about evolution. The concept of selection pressures, that there's something in the environment that is pressuring that species to change. Again, the species isn't making a decision to change, but the pressure comes from those species that are not adapted to the change are going to die, right? That is the pressure. Those that do adapt, do change, or do change over time, or have more fitness, increase their fitness because of those adaptations. This is going to lead to something called convergent evolution. All right, so convergent evolution, when you hear the word converge, you think about things coming together. And so what you don't need to think is that two species are becoming one. What you do need to think is that different species are all coming together with a similar kinds of traits, right? Animals that live in the water are the best example of this. Animals that live in the water all have similar adaptations, right? They all have fins. They all have things that help them swim faster. They all have similarly shaped bodies. There's an extinct reptile. There's a mammal. There's a fish. They all kind of look the same, right? Because they're all adapted for the water. They're all completely distantly related. They're all animals, right? But they're all distantly related, but have similar kinds of adaptations because they live in similar kinds of environments, similar selection pressures. You could say that lots of different ways. These structures, like the fins that you see, the shapes of their bodies, we would call these structures analogous structures. Analogous structures are structures that have similar functions, but aren't necessarily shaped the same way or composed of the same kinds of things. Notice the three different kinds of fins there. For penguins, it's not even a fin; it's considered a wing, right? And the bone structures. Penguins and mammals are kind of similar, but not really. Fish are just completely different altogether, right? We're going to talk about a structure, in fact, in the next slide, that is the opposite of this. And so analogous structures are tied with this idea of convergent evolution, where you have things that are distantly related, yet have a similar kind of structure or a similar kind of function to those structures. Homologous structures are direct evidence of evolution because while those structures may not be similarly functioned, they do have the same basic makeup, right? A cat and a human use their hands for completely different things. Bats fly with their hands, but notice they all have the same pieces, right? They're different shapes, but they're all basically the same pieces. 5 fingers or 4 fingers and a thumb, 2 forearm bones, a long arm bone for a long arm bone for the upper arm. You get the idea. Even whales have this same basic idea. Their structure. This shows a common ancestry. So homologous structures show a common ancestry between organisms. Closer relationship. What is the relationship between these organisms? They're all mammals, right? They're very closely related as opposed to these which are not as closely related. They're all animals, but that's about their only relation to one another. So homologous structures show relationships, show common ancestry because of those similar structures. Not necessarily the same function, but definitely similar structures. Vestigial organs are another evidence. A vestigial organ is an organ or a structure that is no longer being used by that organism, but it probably was used at some point. All right, whales have hind legs. Not really. They have like hip bones or vestigial pelvic bones, according to this picture, right? Do they currently use them? Not really, right? But it kind of points to an ancestral past that maybe at one point these whales did have some sort of leg structure that would need to be attached to a hip bone. And so we have these too. We have a tailbone, right, that we don't have a tail. We have wisdom teeth, even though our mouths aren't long enough to hold them. We have an appendix, even though we really don't eat things that would be necessary for the appendix to be used. It's kind of this extra organ, so to speak. And so, yeah, these are called vestigial organs. They point to an evolutionary past, but they don't really have a function for today. Embryology, study of embryos. Notice something about these embryos. They all look the same, especially in their early stages. And as they develop, they tend to change. And then towards the end of development, they're completely different. It's almost as if their embryonic development mimics their evolutionary development. And so another way of thinking about this is embryos, similarly related embryos, are going to have homologous structures as well. Notice the tail, the gill slits. Another one, there will be a couple others that we won't mention because we don't need extra things on here. But you see the commonalities. As those organisms develop, they lose those commonalities. But in these early stages, they have them. Fish, salamanders, tortoises, chickens, humans, all animals. So in the early stages, they look all the same, but as they develop, they lose those. Our embryology points to our common ancestry as well. And then something that's come along a little later, what every middle school biology student has seen, what Darwin never knew. Of course, Darwin never knew this stuff about the molecular structures of things and the DNA makeup, right? But it's completely changed the way that we think about change over time and evolution. Is molecular evidence. Notice this picture here, the sequence of amino acids in hemoglobin. Most animals have a hemoglobin, and so it's how they carry oxygen to the blood. All animals need oxygen. Notice the relationship between the chimpanzee, the gorilla, and the human. Very similar, right? Very similar versus the horse and the zebra. And notice the horse and the zebra, pretty similar as well. But notice there's some similarities between the horses and the gorillas and everything too. And so just a few, but they're less similar than they are to each other. And so you can look at this. This is just 4 amino acids. If you drew it out and did 20 or so, you'd see even more relationship. And so this is the idea that molecular, like biochemical type stuff, like amino acids, DNA sequences are going to have similar relation in those animals that have closer common ancestry. So let's look at 3 different ways that variation can increase in a population. First one is sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction increases variation inherently because of things like crossing over, because of independent assortment, and a couple other ideas that we learned about in Unit 9. Big idea here is you could just take away and say because of a process of meiosis or gamete production, this is going to increase the amount of variation in populations. And just because of the number of gametes that an organism makes, it's going to increase the number of combinations, whereas asexual reproduction is just simply making a clone. Sexual reproduction has inherent variation, and most of the variation is either beneficial or neutral, and so it's good generally for a population. Mutations also occur, which could be good. I hate to use the word good and bad, but let's think about it. Could be more beneficial, could increase fitness in an organism, or could decrease fitness. But those that increase fitness, what do we know? If they increase fitness, it's going to cause that organism to adapt. That organism is going to survive and reproduce to the next generation, and that particular trait is going to increase the fitness of the entire population. That's the idea. This is how all change ultimately occurs. All change results in a mutation in the DNA, and that DNA can be, or that mutation can just be completely neutral, never be seen, or it could be something that causes that organism to actually change and to be better in its environment. And then lastly is one called polyploidy. Polyploidy is not typically seen as a positive thing, particularly in animals. Remember, we talked about trisomy 21 and non-disjunction. So polyploidy is a result of non-disjunction in the production of gametes, but with some organisms, it actually increases hardiness or increases their ability to survive, particularly plants. It's a good example here. Bananas that we eat off the shelves do not produce seeds. Why not? Because they're sterile. Why are they sterile? Because they're triploid or 3N. They cannot produce an accurate number of gamete or chromosomes in their gametes, and so they're not able to reproduce or make seeds, which makes them a lot more edible. This is an example for us, of course, but there are examples in the wild where plants who have taken on this polyploid or have more than 2 sets of chromosomes have actually increased their survivability, which is going to increase their fitness. And so polyploidy is another example of a way that organisms, especially plants is where you see this, can increase their fitness, which is going to allow them to change over time.